cowboy took 5 stabs for the Apache woman, but when he woke up, 3 Apache women were standing. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Merritt Hale had been in the high country since before dawn, clearing his trap line before the weather turned. He rode with the quiet focus of a man used to surviving alone, not because he preferred it, but because years of loss had made silence easier than speaking. He was 39 and carried more history than he ever discussed. His wife and son had died to fever 6 winters ago in a settlement east of the San Juan Range, and after burying them, he'd left the town, the grave markers and what was left of his name behind. Since then, he'd lived by trading pelts, trapping, and keeping to the unclaimed stretches of land near the New Mexico border. He wasn't looking for trouble. His only goal that day was to pull his last traps before the first hard snow, bring the mule load back to the basin cabin, and stay ahead of the cold. The land around him was open and dry that afternoon, the creek beds reduced to strips of pale mud and scattered stones. The animals had already pulled back to thicker timber, and the light was dropping faster than he liked. His ribs ached from an old break that never healed straight, and his coat smelled of smoke and pine pitch from patching a tear the night before. He was thinking of distance, not people, when he heard the sounds, footsteps scuffling hard against rock, and a woman's breath hitched like someone had struck her. He pulled his horse to a stop and listened. No gunshot, no shouting, just a short, sharp cry that was cut off mid-breath. Not animal, not accident, human fear. He tied the mule off to a cedar branch and stepped down without hesitation, though his mind was already clicking through risks. Could be a trap, could be settlers fighting, could be a raid gone wrong. But the sound had come from a single voice, not a group. Merritt moved down the bank toward the dry wash, rifle in hand, boots rolling silent over the dirt. He stayed low behind brush as he reached the drop-off and looked down. 3 white men stood in the creek bed, rough settler types by their coats and gear. One had a rope, one held a knife, and another leaned on a rifle like he was guarding a sail. Between them stood a young Apache woman with her back pressed to a rock. Her dress was torn along one breast and shoulder. Her lip was swollen, and the way she stood told him she'd been struck more than once. Barefoot, cold, cornered. Merritt didn't know her name, didn't know how she'd been taken or how long she'd been running. But he recognized the look of someone trying not to show fear, because showing it would only make things worse. His jaw tightened. He'd seen this kind of thing before. Men grabbing whoever they figured they could sell or trade without consequence. He had no patience for it. He didn't give them a warning. He stepped into the wash and fired once, clean and sharp. The man with the rope dropped before the others even turned. The one gripping the woman spun and reached for his belt knife. Merritt didn't wait. He was already moving forward. The rifle stock cracked across the man's jaw with a hard swing, and he went down, stunned. The third man rushed him fast, quicker than Merritt expected, and drove a knife across his ribs. The burn of the cut ripped through coat and skin. Merritt grunted, pivoted, and struck with the butt of his rifle again, catching the man high along the temple. The man stumbled back but got another slash in, this one across Merritt's side before going down to his knees. The man whose jaw was broken managed to crawl up, swinging blind with his blade, and one more cut opened across Merritt's back near the shoulder. He struck him down with enough force to stop the fight for good. But the last one, bloodied and panicked, got in a final thrust under Merritt's ribs before bolting up the creek bed and running hard without looking back. The world dimmed at the edges as Merritt dropped to one knee, blood warming the fabric against his side and back. He put a hand over one wound and tried to force air into his lungs through clenched teeth. The thought hit him, not in fear, just in fact, that 5 cuts was pushing his luck. If the bleeding didn't stop, he wouldn't make it out of the wash. He heard soft movement near him and turned his head. The woman was already at his side. Up close, he saw the dirt on her cheek, the bruise under her eye, and the way her shoulder shook though she tried to stay still. The neckline of her torn dress hung low against her chest, one strap nearly off entirely, but she didn't pull it up or look embarrassed. She looked at his wounds instead, assessing fast. She didn't speak English, Or if she did, she chose not to waste words. She pressed her palm against his side, hard enough that he had to grit his teeth not to shove her hand away. When he tried to get to his feet, his legs dipped and his breath caught. He thought briefly about his horse, his rifle, and the mule, how far they were and whether he could reach them before the bleeding took him down. Then he realized she was hauling his arm over her shoulder, guiding him toward the ridge. She was smaller but determined, pulling his weight with more force than he'd expect. He tried to walk, but his vision wavered. The pain in his side pulsed with every step, and after 20 paces, he wasn't sure where the tree started or ended. He had the thought, clear and practical, that if she were leading him to another danger, he wouldn't be in shape to fight. But he also understood that if she left him there, he would die before dark. He didn't remember losing consciousness, just the feel of her shoulder under his arm and the ground tilting out from under him. Then nothing. The woman's name was Sana. She had been traveling alone for 3 days, hiding in arroyos and abandoned shelters after being separated from what was left of her people. Her uncle's small band had been pushed north weeks earlier, and she didn't know who was alive. The men chasing her had caught her near the foothills that morning. She ran until they took her down and tore her dress to try to hold her. She didn't scream for long because screaming never helped before. She had not expected the stranger to help her. She didn't know if he killed for money, justice, or something else. But he bled for it, and she understood what that meant in this land. She dragged him toward the ruined adobe trading shelter she'd been hiding in the night before, built half into a hill with one wall still standing and a low roof set with old pine beams. It was the only cover she knew of within reach. He went down twice, and she dragged him through grit and brush, her breath shaking, hands slipping on his coat. Blood streaked across her arms where it soaked through his shirt. By the time she got him inside, the light was thin and cold. She laid him on the old bedding there, pulled the coat from his shoulders, and cut his shirt open with the same knife one of the men had dropped. She worked fast, using strips of cloth, water from a clay jug, and pressure where she could stop the bleeding. Her hands didn't shake once she started working. She didn't expect him to live through the night. She also didn't expect what happened next. 2 other women finding the trail of blood and her footprints in the dust and following it in the dark. Night settled over the abandoned trading shelter without ceremony, the kind of cold that made the air feel thinner the longer a person breathed it. The roof let wind in through a split beam near the back wall, and the dirt floor held no warmth except where a small fire crawled in a circle of stones. The man, Merritt Hale, lay on an old blanket that still smelled faintly of sheep wool and dust. His bandages were dark through in places where the bleeding hadn't fully stopped. His coat and shirt were piled near the entrance, stiff with dry blood. Sana sat beside him with her back against the wall. She didn't sleep. Her hands were streaked with his blood and ash from the fire. Every so often she pressed a palm against his side to feel if his breathing had changed. His face stayed pale, jaw clenched, brow tight, even in unconsciousness. She didn't know his name or why he'd helped her. She only knew he had killed for her and been cut again and again because he hadn't walked away. She had questions, why he was alone in this country, whether he had a place or people nearby, if he would turn on her once he stood again. But those thoughts moved through her mind like quiet steps, not frantic ones. She had seen men show mercy and regret it later. She had seen them help and then sell. She didn't assume anything about him, good or bad. Not yet. It was late when she heard the footsteps. They were careful, not rushing, but close enough that she reached for the knife she'd taken off one of the men he'd killed. Before she stood, a shadow crossed the half-open doorway. Awi entered first, tall and narrow-faced, her dark hair braided in a single rope down her back. Her dress, once meant for ceremony, was torn at the hem and smudged with road dirt. Her eyes moved from Sana to the man on the ground, then to the blood on the floor. She didn't speak right away. Behind her came Taya, younger by several years, eyes wide and uncertain. She wore a calico dress taken off some settler's woman, too loose in the shoulders, buttons missing, one sleeve barely holding by the threads. She held her arms tight around herself as if she hadn't been warm in days. They had followed spoor and blood. They had heard men shouting earlier, echoing through the rocks, and tracked what they thought might lead to supplies or danger. They didn't expect to see Sana again. Not here, not alive, not with a white man bleeding on the floor beside her. Awi's voice was low when she finally spoke in Apache. "You dragged him here?" Sana answered with a short nod. Her voice was rough from cold and thirst. He stopped them. She didn't explain further. She didn't mention how he fought, how he didn't hesitate, how his first instinct had been to kill the one tying the rope. Taya stepped farther in, gaze fixed on Merritt's chest, rising shallow under the blanket. "He will die," she said softly. "He hasn't yet," Sana replied. Awi crouched by the fire and lifted one of the stones to see the coals underneath. She glanced around the shelter, taking stock the way someone does when expecting to leave fast if needed. "Others saw you taken," she said. "They will wonder where the men went." Sana knew she was right. The one who ran could bring others, or stumble into another camp and talk. Men like that didn't stay quiet about being cut down by a lone rider. Sana looked at Merritt again. His breath hitched once, pain showing across his brow. His hand twitched near his stomach, but didn't rise. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck to feel his pulse. It was there, faint but fighting. Awi watched her do it. "He helped you," she said, not as a question. "He killed one," Sana answered. "Hurt the others before they hurt him." Taya sat near the doorway and wrapped her arms tighter around herself. Why would he? Sana didn't know yet. She only knew she hadn't expected any man to interfere, and yet he had. He hadn't yelled or postured or tried to trade first. He acted like it was already decided. That unsettled her as much as it calmed her. The fire burned low, throwing their shadows against the wall. Merritt shifted once, and his breath caught hard enough to drag him halfway to waking. His thoughts came in broken pieces, thick with pain and cold. He felt hands on him, not rough, not prying, but firm. He smelled smoke, wool, blood. For a moment, he expected to feel the ground under him still, the dead weight of his rifle in his hand, and the man with the knife standing over him. But the sound of voices, women's voices, kept him from forcing his eyes open. He wasn't afraid, not in the way a man is when he knows he is outnumbered. He was calculating without words, trying to understand if he was safe or already finished and just hadn't bled out yet. He remembered the feel of dragging footsteps and the sound of fabric tearing when the woman pulled him upright. He remembered someone holding him up when his legs gave. And in the moments before darkness took him, he'd registered one clear decision. If he lived, he wouldn't leave her to die. Sana adjusted one of the cloth strips at his side. Awi moved closer then and saw how many wounds there really were. 5 cuts across his ribs, shoulder, and back. One deeper and still bleeding through. She met Sana's eyes across him, understanding what that meant. If he died, they'd be alone again. If he lived, they wouldn't know what kind of man he was until he could stand. "We stay through morning," Awi said quietly. "If he breathes still, we decide then." Sana agreed with a small nod and added more wood to the fire. Taya lay near the back wall, her head on a folded blanket, but her eyes stayed open. Her fingers traced the edge of a burn scar on her arm, like it was the only familiar thing she still owned. The night stretched on. Merritt slipped into a deeper dark, his body fighting to stay above the pull of blood loss. Once near dawn, he tried to roll on his side, and a sharp pain ripped through his chest. Sana's hand came down firm on his shoulder to keep him still. In the gray light before sunrise, he woke. He didn't open his eyes fast. He listened first. The crackle of a low fire. Soft breathing nearby. Fabric rustling as someone moved. His side hurt, like someone had poured sand and heat into the wound. When he finally blinked his eyes open, the first thing he saw was the woman from the creek sitting near him. Hair loose around her shoulders, the torn strap of her dress hanging low enough that he could see the edge of her breast before she pulled the blanket up around herself. Not out of shame, just against the cold. He stared past her then and saw 2 more women, both watching him. Their eyes didn't hold panic, only caution. They expected him conscious now. They didn't know what he'd do. He didn't know either, not yet. His throat was dry when he spoke, voice low and flat. "You pull the knife out." Sana studied him, then nodded once. He winced when he tried to sit up, and one of the other women, Awi shifted closer but didn't touch him. He felt the weight of the blankets, the dried blood stiff against his skin, and the cold air creeping through the roof beams. He looked at Sana again. You alone when I found you? She hesitated for half a second, not to lie, but to decide how much truth to give a man who had killed and almost died without asking a name first. Then she answered, voice quiet but steady. Not anymore. He let that sit. His eyes moved to the doorway, then to his coat across the room. He didn't ask where his rifle was. If they meant to use it on him, they'd have done it already. He rested his head back against the rolled blanket, breath shallow. The pain was a steady throb he could live with for now. What he couldn't ignore was the simple fact in front of him. 3 women, no weapons beyond a knife, no food in sight, and nowhere safe within a day's walk. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing without speaking it. He hadn't bled 5 times just to walk away from them now, and they could see it in the way he stayed silent. Merritt stayed still longer than he wanted to, not because he was afraid of the women, but because sitting up too fast might tear something open and make the whole night's bleeding start again. His breath was shallow, and the bandages pulled tight across his ribs every time he drew in air. He needed water. He needed to move his arms. He needed to figure out where his gear was. And he needed to understand who these women were and what kind of trouble might follow them. Sana watched him without speaking. She wasn't hovering, but she was close enough to reach him if he passed out again. Her hair was tangled and fell down over one shoulder, partly covering the torn strap and the bruise on her collarbone. She hadn't washed the blood off her arms yet. Some dried, some smeared. It wasn't all his. Merritt tried to shift his legs and get an elbow under him. Pain shot across his side, but it didn't knock him out this time. He grunted and pushed harder. Awi rose and moved around the fire, stepping closer as if ready to keep him from falling. She didn't touch him, but she didn't back away either. He managed to sit upright against the shelter wall, breath controlled, eyes scanning. He checked the doorway, the corners, the fire, the ceiling gap where cold air slipped through. Then he looked at the 3 women. He wanted names before anything else. You got others coming? He asked, voice low but clearer than before. Awi understood enough English to follow. She shook her head once. Only us. He studied her, older than Sana, leaner, eyes sharp. Then his gaze moved to the younger one sitting near the doorway. Taya had dark circles under her eyes and dirt across her feet, like she'd walked far without rest. She didn't meet his eyes directly. Merritt looked back to Sana. That man who ran, you think he'll bring more? She answered him without flinching. If he lives, if he finds help. Her English was accented, but careful, as if she'd learned it young but stopped using it often. Merritt nodded once. It was the same concern he had. He didn't know how close any settlement was to this wash, but men who hunted others usually had somewhere to run to. If the runner made it to his camp, he'd talk, and more men would come, either to claim revenge or to finish what they started. His jaw tightened. I need my rifle. Awi motioned toward the back corner. It leaned there against a slanted wall beam, wiped clean of blood but still unloaded. His coat was next to it, his shirt folded in a pile with the ruined scrap Sana had cut away. His knife and a spare cartridge belt were placed beside the fire. He scanned their faces again, trying to understand why they hadn't taken anything or run while he slept. Most would have. You touch my horse? He asked. Sana shook her head. We did not go back. That told him enough. The mule and horse were still tied somewhere along the creek. If a wolf or a settler found them, that was a problem waiting to happen. A silence followed, not tense, just uncertain. Taya finally spoke for the first time since he'd woken. Will you make us leave? Her voice was soft and unsteady, but the question hung heavy. She expected him to demand the shelter back now that he was alive. It wouldn't be the first time someone did. Merritt breathed through the ache in his ribs and stared at the fire before answering. If I wanted you gone, I'd have left you in the wash. Taya lowered her eyes in relief, and Awi seemed to accept that as enough for now. Sana didn't move at all, but some tightness left her shoulders. Another question followed that most listeners would be asking themselves. Why had he risked his life at all? He spoke before they asked it. I've seen things like that before. Didn't stop it then. He paused, eyes fixed on the floor. Didn't plan to watch it again. That answer didn't explain everything, but it was the truth, and they seemed to understand it. The next problem was clear. He was hurt bad, and staying in a half-rotten shelter this close to a killing ground wouldn't hold long. They needed water, food, firewood, and a roof that didn't leak. If riders came through and saw signs of the fight, they'd follow tracks, blood, anything left behind. Merritt motioned to Sana. "Where'd you drag me from?" She pointed down the ridge. Dry Creek, north of the Cedars. He tried to picture distance. If he bled all the way from there to here, the trail would be easy to follow. Awi seemed to read his thoughts. Tracks still fresh. Merritt looked at the light coming through the roof crack. Morning was spreading, weak, but there. His body hurt, but his head was steady enough to think. He needed time to move, time to stop bleeding, time to get ahead of whoever might be coming. He turned to Sana. "You sew?" She nodded once. "You split wood? Carry water?" Another nod. He looked to Awi. "You track?" Awi answered without hesitation. "Better than most men here." Last, he looked at Taya. "You cook?" She hesitated, afraid of the wrong answer. "If there is food." Merritt leaned his head back against the wall, breathing through the pain again. He'd made up his mind before speaking the next words, even if it would cost him strength he didn't have. "I got a place up in the basin. Half a day's ride if the snow don't start. Cabin stocked. Roof holds. No one goes there but me." He scanned them each in turn. "You help me walk there, you stay as long as you want. Nobody touches you under my roof." The words were plain, not generous, not dramatic, just a deal a man could uphold. Taya's mouth parted like she didn't believe him at first. Awi looked cautious, not grateful yet. Sana held his gaze the longest, weighing him. She was used to bargains that turned bad later. She couldn't read this one yet, but she saw he was telling it straight. Before any of them could speak, Merritt added one more truth, heavy and final. "But I can't ride that far alone. I stand up wrong. I'll bleed out and drop dead before midday. You leave me here, I don't last." Awi exchanged a glance with Sana. Taya stared at his wounds. Then Sana asked something no one else would have thought to. "Your horse and mule. Where?" He gave her the location in few words. She nodded slowly, already deciding what she would have to do. The unspoken question, would they really help him or take their chance and run, hung in the cold air. None of them were safe alone, and he knew it, and they knew he knew it. But sometimes survival starts with one person refusing to look away, and none of them had anywhere else to go. Merritt tested his strength before speaking again. He pressed a hand against the wall and tried to push himself up a few inches. The bandages held, but the pain flared enough to tell him he wouldn't stay on his feet long without tearing something open. He stayed seated. His voice came out rough but measured. "We can't stay here. If that man gets back with others, they'll track the blood and find the wash, then find this place." Awi nodded, already thinking the same. "If they come before we leave, do you fight or hide?" Merritt didn't hesitate. "Fight if I have to. Better to move before it gets that far." Taya looked from him to Sana. "How can he walk?" "He doesn't," Sana said. "Not yet." Merritt turned his eyes toward her. She had cleaned some of the dried blood off her hands, but hadn't washed the bruises from her shoulder or throat. He noticed how she kept glancing at the doorway like she was listening for men on horseback. He also noticed that she didn't look at him with fear, just calculation. He answered her unspoken concern. "I'll walk if I'm held up, but getting the horse and mule comes first." Awi stepped closer to the fire. "We go for them. We know how to lead stock." Merritt watched the two older women, both steady, both used to moving under threat. He also knew the creek bed wasn't far, but the risk sat in how visible the ground might be after daylight spread. "You go toward the Cedars," he said. "The wash bends east. My horse is tied where the slope dips. Mule's to the right, near a dead branch. If they spooked and ran, follow the drag marks. Rope's still on them." Awi absorbed everything without asking twice. Taya listened hard, though she looked unsure about leaving the shelter. Sana asked the question that lingered over the plan. "If soldiers or men from the settlement ride near the creek, what then?" "Keep the animals out of sight," Merritt said. "Don't argue, don't run in the open. If they don't look close, they won't see you. He didn't give empty reassurances. He didn't pretend they were safe. He just laid out what could keep them alive. Taya looked at Sana, then at Aoi. All three of us go. Merritt stopped that quick. No. One stays to keep the fire and watch the ridge. One helps bring the stock. One carries water and bandages if I start bleeding through. Sana chose for them. Aoi goes. I stay. Taya carries for us. Taya looked startled, but Sana's tone left no room to argue. Aoi gave her a brief nod and turned to gather what she'd need. Merritt pointed to a water skin near the corner. Fill that from the jug before you go. Take a strip of cloth. If you see blood pools still wet at the wash, cover them with mud or ash. Aoi didn't answer with words. She tied her braid tighter, slung the water skin over her shoulder, and checked the knife in her belt. Taya moved to follow, but Sana caught her sleeve. Take a blanket. The mule will need it. His back sore's easy. Merritt glanced at Sana, surprised she'd thought of that. She noticed, then looked away like it meant nothing. When Aoi and Taya left, the doorway felt larger and the wind came through in colder threads. Sana stayed near the fire, quiet. Merritt closed his eyes a moment, not from sleep, but to calm the weight of pain in his side. His head was clear enough, but every breath reminded him how close he'd come to dying. He spoke without looking at her. You three, how long out here alone? You got family somewhere. Sana didn't answer right away. Her voice came low, and even when she finally did. We walked from the San Francisco peaks. Before that, we were with our uncle's people. Soldiers came, and some men from the mining camps. We ran. Others scattered different ways. We do not know who lives. Merritt opened his eyes. You find each other on the trail? She nodded. Weeks ago. Not at the same time. No camp takes women without men to speak for them. Settlers chase us, or traders come take. We hide more than we walk. He understood the shape of their journey then. No home, no band, and no safe ground to rest on. He'd seen it before, tribes broken, families split, women taken or left behind. He shifted slowly, testing his legs under the blanket. His voice stayed level. My cabin's 5 hours by horse. 7 if we stop. There's a storehouse dug into the hill. Winters get bad, but the ground's dry. Sana watched him, studying if he was telling truth. Why say we may stay? Merritt let the question settle, then gave the only answer that wasn't a lie. Because I don't leave people for the coyotes. Not anymore. She looked at him long, then turned to adjust a log in the fire. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, just tired. A while later, a scraping sound at the doorway made them both look up. It wasn't hoofbeats or voices, just brush shifting. Merritt reached for his knife from the pile of his gear. Sana's hand went to the smaller blade she'd taken earlier. They waited, listening. Then Aoi's voice came from outside, low and firm. It's us. They entered with the horse first. Then the mule led close behind. The animals were jumpy but uninjured, and the rope burns on the mule's neck showed they hadn't broken free on their own. Taya carried the blanket and the water skin, both full. Aoi had dried blood on her forearm that wasn't there before, but she didn't mention it. There were tracks, she said to Merritt, voice quiet but direct. 3 horses, not from yesterday, older, but close to the wash. Merritt nodded once, meaning he heard, not that he was easy about it. Sana rose and took the mule's rope, tying him off near the back wall where the roof dipped lowest. The horse backed once, then settled after Merritt gave a short whistle he'd used 100 times on the trail. He looked at the sky through the crack in the roof. The light had started to dull again, midday, sliding toward evening. We leave by dawn, he said. No later. Aoi agreed. You walk. Some, he said. You two ride double on the mule till I can take his lead. Horse carries supplies. Sana spoke up. And if the man who ran brings others before we go? Merritt answered without raising his tone. Then I kill more of them and we leave faster. No one doubted he meant it. They didn't sleep much through the afternoon. They took turns packing what little they had, dried bark, old blankets, half-ruined tools left in the shelter. They cleaned the worst of his wounds again. He didn't flinch when Sana pulled a bandage tight. She didn't apologize for the pain. Listeners would have wondered about his gear, what he carried, what he'd lost in the fight, and how he meant to travel wounded. That was answered as he checked every item they'd gathered. Rifle cleaned and loaded now, knife strapped to his belt, coat folded but close, a canteen, flint bedroll, and 2 small pouches, one of salt, one of medicine bark he'd carried since spring. Before night fell, Sana asked the one question none of them had voiced yet. If we reach your cabin, do we hide there, or do you send word to someone? Merritt didn't blink. No one to send word to. The admission settled something unspoken. They were not walking into another man's family. They were not stepping under someone else's rule. His land held no woman waiting, no child, no partner, no ranch hands, no neighbor close enough to claim them. He wasn't rescuing them for someone else's household. It would be his roof, his food, and his responsibility if they went. The fire burned low. Outside, the first breath of snow carried on the wind, light but real. They could smell it before it showed. No one asked again if they would go. They were already going. They broke camp before first light. No talking, no fire, no delay. The air outside the shelter cut sharp in the lungs, and the sky held only a faint gray smear over the ridge. Merritt tried to stand on his own first, bracing a hand against the wall. The wounds pulled like hot wire through his ribs and back, but his legs held long enough for him to take 2 slow steps. That was enough to show them he wouldn't be carried. Sana wrapped a strip of cloth around his middle once more, tighter than before to keep the bleeding down. He didn't look at her while she worked, but he didn't push her hand away either. Awi and Taya readied the horse and mule. Merritt's saddle was too heavy for his side, so Awi rigged a rope lead instead, looping it around the horn to drag the packs rather than carry them on his back. A question hung in the air that most listeners would ask. What about food for the ride? Merritt settled it without being prompted. He pointed to a shallow crate buried under broken boards in the corner. Inside were strips of smoked deer meat he'd stored weeks earlier, a half bag of hard biscuits, and a small tin of coffee grounds wrapped in cloth. He hadn't planned on sharing it with anyone, but he didn't hesitate when Taya looked at the supplies like she wasn't sure they were meant for them. "We take what we can carry," he said. "Cabin has more." That answered another unspoken concern, whether the cabin truly existed or if he'd invented it to buy their help. His voice made it clear it was real. They stepped out into the morning. The mule snorted and shook his head, breath fogging in the air. The horse pawed the ground once, then stilled when Merritt laid a hand on its neck. Sana moved quietly beside him, watching how his balance shifted, ready if he faltered. Awi took point, scanning the ridge line and the stretch of brush that led down toward the wash. They didn't take the direct path back through the creek bed. Merritt pointed them east along a rocky cut where tracks wouldn't show so clear. They walked slow at first. Merritt gripped the mule's lead rope to steady his steps. Each rise in the trail made his vision sting at the edges, but he kept moving. Twice, Sana put a hand under his arm when he stumbled. He didn't thank her, but he didn't shake her off. They traveled in silence until the sun finally bled a pale light behind the cloud cover. That's when Merritt stopped and looked back the way they came. If anyone followed, he said, they'll look for blood. We left some on the path. Awi glanced at the ground. Yours. Some, he admitted. Enough to track if they're close. Sana pulled a strip of cloth from her belt, one she'd cut from the shredded hem of her dress, and dipped it in the water skin Taya carried. She wiped the stones behind them where drops still showed. Taya followed and dragged brush across the dirt where footprints had pressed too deep. Merritt leaned against the mule until they finished. His breathing was thin but steady. Listeners might wonder if he feared collapse more than pursuit. He didn't. He'd collapsed before in worse places. But he wouldn't let himself drop until the women were off exposed ground. When Sana returned to his side, he spoke again, more out of need for clarity than courtesy. If I fall out here, you don't try lifting me. You take the stock and keep walking. Don't waste the chance. She stared at him, slow and unreadable. You fall and breathe still, we don't leave you. He didn't argue, but his jaw tightened. He was a man used to dying alone if it came to it. They pushed on. By late morning, the land changed. Less rock, more scrub pine and dry grass. Merritt knew every turn of this country, every hill that hit a gulch, every animal track that cut between ridges. He'd trapped in these parts for years. Listeners might have wondered how a man like him ended up out here with no one waiting at home. He'd never spoken aloud, but it showed in the way he avoided looking at the horizon too long. Taya finally asked the question none of the others had dared. Your wife died? Merritt didn't stop walking. And my boy. She said nothing else after that. Sana didn't look at him, but something in her expression shifted. Recognition, not pity. They reached a narrow stream bed with just enough water to fill the skin again. Awi checked tracks in the mud. Deer, 2 days old, no boots or horses. That eased some of the strain around Merritt's eyes. They rested only long enough for him to catch his breath. When he sat on a low rock, his back went stiff and his face tightened until the pain settled. Sana crouched in front of him and checked the bandage beneath his coat without asking permission first. He didn't flinch when her hand pressed the edge of the wound, but he grunted low when she tied it off again. The neckline of her torn dress shifted when she leaned in. The cloth still hung loose over her breast where the strap had ripped days earlier. He looked away out of discipline, not discomfort, but he didn't pretend he hadn't seen. He spoke while she tied the knot. When we reach the open basin, stay close to the rocks. My cabin's against the rise. Smoke don't show unless the wind changes. Awi studied his face, measure in her eyes. She had her doubts earlier about trusting a settler man with no kin, but his knowledge of the land was too precise to fake. By early afternoon, clouds thickened and the first flakes of snow finally showed, thin and dry. The mule's ears twitched at each gust. Taya walked with her head down and her hands tucked into the sleeves of her dress, shivering but quiet. Another question surfaced that a listener might wonder. Did the man who ran survive long enough to raise anyone? Merritt addressed it once they reached a ridge overlook. He was cut across the head and bleeding bad. If he made it out, he'd need half a day to reach the mining camp south of here. He paused. If they believed him, they'd come slow. Men don't hunt in weather turning like this unless there's strong reason. And his friends? Awi asked. He had 2 left after I shot the first, Merritt said. 1 dead down in that wash. 1 likely dying if his skull broke. The last one ran. Could be he never made it. Sana glanced at him. If he does, he will speak of you. And of us. Merritt nodded once. Then I'll be ready. They didn't press him on how. They didn't ask what kind of man he'd been before. But the way he carried himself, wounds or not, answered it quietly. He'd survived long enough to not scare easy. As the snow began to fall thicker, the land ahead sloped down into the basin he'd spoken of, pine pockets, rock bluffs, and a cut of ground that disappeared behind a rise where no smoke would travel far. Before they descended, he stopped and pointed. You see that line of boulders? Cabin sits behind him. There's a spring close. No one rides near it unless they know it's there. They didn't speak, but the tension in their shoulders loosened. It was real. They weren't walking toward nothing. They moved down the rocky path slow and careful. Merritt leaned heavier on the mule's lead this time, steps shorter, breath tight. Sana watched his face each time he stumbled. Not with panic, just readiness. By the time they reached the shadow of the boulders, the snow was coating the mule's back. The horse shook it off, ears twitching at some distant sound only he heard. Awi walked ahead to check the cabin's approach. Taya stayed close behind, carrying the last of the food and the water skin. Merritt paused once before stepping beyond the rocks and looked at Sana. When we get inside, he said, you take the back room. Rest. I'll stay near the fire. She held his eyes a few seconds before answering. We all rest. Then we see what comes. He didn't disagree. They rounded the last rise, and the cabin finally came into view. Rough-hewn logs, stone chimney, narrow doorway, shutters drawn tight. Smoke hadn't been there in days, but the place still stood solid against the slope. They had shelter. For now. Whether anyone would come looking, and how far the past they carried would follow them, would be answered soon enough. The cabin door stuck before it gave, swollen from old rain and cold seasons, but Merritt braced a shoulder against the frame and pushed it open. The inside held the stillness of a place left alone but not abandoned. Dust on the floor, coals long dead in the stone hearth, blankets folded on a narrow bunk against the wall. A table stood near the window with a tin cup and a whetstone on it, exactly where he'd left them before heading into the high country. He stepped in first, not waiting to see if they followed, but he stopped near the hearth when the pain in his ribs caught up with him again. Sana entered next and took in everything with measured eyes. The stacked wood by the door, the small iron stove, the shelf with jars of salt, beans, dried apples, and lard. There were 2 hooks on the far wall where someone's coats once hung, now empty. She didn't speak, but she knew at a glance this was a place built by one man for one life. Awi came in after leading the mule to a lean-to behind the cabin. She checked every corner, not like someone suspicious of him, but like someone who had learned never to assume a door meant safety. Taya lingered just inside the threshold, rubbing her hands together and staring at the smoke-blackened chimney. Merritt nodded toward the pile of split wood. Get a fire going. Cold will take the heat out of the walls fast. Awi didn't wait. She knelt by the hearth, arranged the kindling, and struck the flint he handed her. The wood caught slow but steady, and soon the room started to shift from dead chill to something more human. Merritt lowered himself into the single chair at the table, one hand on his ribs. Sana crouched beside him and untied the bandage across his side to check the bleeding. The cloth was stained but not soaked through, better than before. When she pressed her palm gently around the wound to feel for heat, he didn't pull away. She tied fresh strips across his ribs, using his own shirt she had washed in the creek before they left the shelter. Taya moved quietly around the room, taking in details listeners might have wondered about. How a man like him kept himself alive here, what he owned, what he'd lost. She found a stack of pelts rolled and sealed with twine under the bunk. Fox, badger, coyote, and 1 black wolf. She also found a small wooden box with a few coins, a folded scrap of paper, and an old ring worn thin with years. She didn't touch any of it. A question most would have by now. What was Merritt before all this? He answered without being asked as Sana finished tying the cloth. I rode with the 2nd New Mexico Volunteers when the war came, he said, voice even. Scout mostly. Knew the rivers, the high passes. Stayed on when they pushed bands off these lands. Thought I was doing right then. He didn't look at them when he said it. His eyes stayed on the fire. Sana's hands paused, then kept working. Awi listened while stacking heavier logs into the hearth. Taya sat by the wall with her arms wrapped around her legs, saying nothing. Merritt added, my wife was mescalero. Half. Son was 2. Didn't matter to most white men. Didn't matter to most Apache either. Fever took them in a week. That settled another silence no one dared to break before. He hadn't just lost them. He'd lived between 2 sides and been left standing with neither. When he finally looked up, he met Sana's eyes. He didn't ask for understanding, but she gave a small nod anyway, more acknowledgement than comfort. Awi rose from the floor. What about men from the camp? She asked. If they tracked you, they won't reach this far before dark, Merritt said. And if they do, they won't find the path easy in snow. Taya glanced to the single window shutter. You have guns. 2, he said. Rifle and a 6-shot under the bunk. Ammo's dry. Enough for a fight, but not for a war. Another unspoken concern surfaced. Sleep and safety. There's a loft above, he said, pointing to a ladder near the corner. Empty but tight-walled. 2 can sleep there. 1 takes the bunk. I'll take the floor by the hearth so I can hear the door. Awi spoke first. You cannot stand guard if you bleed when you breathe. I'll hear what comes, he answered. That's enough. Sana didn't argue. Instead, she stood and went to the small basin near the shelves. She poured water from a clay jug and washed the blood from her arms and collarbone. The torn neckline of her dress gaped wide when she leaned over the basin. For the first time since meeting him, she pulled the fabric up to cover herself, not out of fear, but because she was no longer outside in wind and dirt. Merritt didn't stare, but he noticed the change, how the cloth still barely held around her shoulder where the stitching had ripped. He remembered women back in the settlements turning their backs or hiding themselves quick around men. Sana didn't either. She moved like someone used to being seen and ignored in the same breath. They ate in silence. Dried meat softened in hot water, a tin cup of wheat coffee passed between them, and 1 biscuit each. It wasn't enough, but no one complained. As the fire warmed the room, Taya's eyelids dipped. Awi checked her wounds. old bruises on her ribs, and a scrape near her hip from falling days earlier. Listeners might have wondered if Taya was the youngest or if she had family once. The answer came from Awi, quiet and flat. Her brother sold for horses last spring. Her mother taken to the fort years before. She was left. Taya didn't lift her head when it was said. Sana glanced at her once, then looked back to the fire. Merritt said nothing, but his jaw set hard again. He finally pushed himself to stand, bracing a hand on the table. Pain tightened his breath, but he managed. At first light, we check the ridge. If no one's followed, we cut a trail behind the cabin and bring in wood and water for 3 days. Awi asked, "And if riders come?" He met her eyes. "Then they don't leave." The words were quiet, not boastful, and that made them hold weight. Before anyone slept, he went to the back corner and lifted a floorboard most wouldn't notice. Beneath it lay a hidden crate, wrapped canvas, extra cartridges, a spare knife, a pouch of salt, and strips of birch bark for fire starting. He set the supplies on the table. "You asked before," he said, looking at Sana. "Why I helped you. The last time I didn't, it cost more than one life. I don't let that happen again." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Outside, the snow fell harder against the roof. Inside, the fire held steady, and for the first time since the creek bed, none of them were exposed to the open ground. Whether they trusted it yet or not, survival had shifted from chance to choice. They slept in shifts through the night. No one said it out loud, but none of them trusted sleep fully yet. Not with the memory of the wash, the man who ran, or the cold that could turn a wound deadly by morning. Awi took first watch by the door, sitting on a stool with Merritt's rifle across her knees. She had asked him how to use it before he dozed off, and he showed her in 3 quiet steps: lever, aim, breathe. She handled it like she had held guns before, not as an expert, but as someone who understood what they could do. Merritt didn't sleep long. The fire settled low, and every time the wind shifted against the roof, the draft by the floor cut through the blanket pulled over him. His ribs throbbed in pulses that wouldn't let his body sink fully into rest. But the pain wasn't what kept him sharp, it was habit. Years of traveling and guarding his own back had trained him to wake at any sound that didn't belong. Near dawn, Awi nudged Sana awake to take her turn. Taya lay curled by the bunk with a blanket up to her chin, breathing steady for once. Sana sat by the fire, stoked the embers quietly, and checked the window slat for tracks outside. Snow kept falling on and off through the night, covering whatever prints might have been left behind. Merritt watched from where he lay. He hadn't spoken since midnight, but his eyes were open. Sana noticed, but said nothing. She poured a little water from the kettle into a tin cup and set it near him. When he finally sat up, slow and held together by grit more than strength, she handed it over. He drank half before speaking. "Soon as it's light, I'll check the ridge above the cabin. You bleed if you climb," she said, not as argument but fact. "I'll take the slope behind the chimney," he answered. "Shorter climb. I just need to see the draw and the wash mouth. If there's a rider on the trail, I'll know it." A moment passed before she nodded once. She didn't try to talk him out of it. Awi rested across from him, still holding the rifle. She listened, then asked what many might wonder. "You think the man from the wash survived?" Merritt rubbed his side once, careful. "If he did, he'll ride with others. If he didn't, it ends there." Sana asked the harder question. "If riders come and see us here, what do they do?" He didn't soften the answer. "They take what they want, same as before. Or they shoot to make a point." His tone didn't waver. "It won't happen." That final line settled more nerves than a speech would have. By first light, he stood again. Sana wrapped a second strip of cloth across his back to keep the bandage from shifting. His coat was stiff but warm. He took the rifle back from Awi and checked the chamber before stepping outside. Snow came up to his boot tops in places but hadn't drifted high against the walls. The sky hung low, pale, half hidden behind broken cloud. He walked without speaking, his breath marked in the air. His steps slowed once when the pain shot down his ribs, but he didn't stop. Sana watched from the doorway until he disappeared behind the rise. Inside, Awi checked the supplies again. Taya swept the floor with a pine branch, dragging leaves and dirt toward the door. Some listeners might have wondered how these women trusted a stranger's cabin enough to settle their bodies inside. Truth was, they didn't entirely, but the walls were solid, the roof held snow, and the man who lived there bled for them without asking what they could give in return. While she tied, kindling into bundles, Taya finally spoke the worry that had sat in her chest since the creek bed. If men come and see us in his house, they say he stole us. Or traded. Awi didn't dismiss it. Let them say it when they choke on their teeth. Sana added, we decide when to run if he falls. Not them. Their words weren't bravado. They were answers shaped by months of choosing between hunger, cold, and men who thought a woman alone was property. Time passed without sound but the fire. Merritt climbed the ridge and crouched low behind the rocks. He scanned the basin, the trail he'd taken with them the day before, and a distant bend of the dry creek bed. No tracks cut the snow fresh. No riders. The wind had buried most signs of their movement. He waited longer than he needed to, not out of fear, but to be certain. His breath caught twice, and he pressed a hand to his ribs until it eased. Pain meant he was alive. He'd learned to live with worse. On the way back down, he stopped once by the spring that ran under a thin crust of ice behind the cabin. He broke it with a stone and filled the small copper dipper he'd left there years ago. The cold water steadied the pounding in his head. Back inside, he leaned the rifle by the doorway and lowered himself onto the chair again. Sana knelt and checked his bandage for bleeding. The wound above his ribs had seeped a little, but nothing like before. She pressed the cloth, then looked at him to see if he'd protest. He didn't. Awi asked the question plain. Anyone near? No, he said. Not yet. Trail's covered. Wash is quiet. If he made it out, he didn't come back before dawn. That gave them a peace of morning without fear. He motioned toward the back of the cabin. Cellars behind the trapdoor. Salt meat and beans. Enough to last 2 weeks if careful. Taya blinked. You kept food for just you? I keep food because Snow don't care how many live here, he replied. It answered another hole in the listeners' minds. How long could they stay? Long enough if no one forced them out. Awi still wasn't done measuring him. You plan for us to leave when you heal? He met her eyes straight. I don't plan for you to leave. I plan for us not to be chased out. That was the first time he'd said us. They didn't thank him. But something shifted in the air. Less uncertainty, more arrangement. Sana did the same thing she'd done the night before. Checked his breathing, pressed the cloth to make sure bleeding stopped, and once she was satisfied, she sat back on her heels. Her dress slipped again where the torn seam hung low across her shoulder. He didn't look away this time. Not long, but enough to show awareness. She saw it, understood it, and did not rise or cover herself. Instead, she asked, You have extra cloth or clothes? It was not modesty, just practicality. The dress she wore wouldn't last another day before tearing further. He pointed to a chest near the bunk. Inside were folded clothes, old shirts, pants, a wool coat too small for him now, and scraps of fabric from years of patching. Sana took what she needed and nothing more. Awi did the same. Taya unfolded a small wool shirt and held it to her chest as if she couldn't believe it was real. Another question listeners might have held. Did he intend for them to stay only as long as he was injured? He addressed that without being prompted. I buried my family on land no one visits, he said quietly. I didn't come here to die, but I didn't expect company either. If you stay, you live by my fire same as I do. No man touches you here. No traders come unless I say so. Awi studied him. And if someone claims us as property, he looked evenly at her. They go in the ground. No threat, no boast. Just a rule. Sana rose and checked the door latch while Awi sealed a draft in the wall with rolled cloth. Taya stirred beans in a pot by the fire with a wood spoon too big for her hand. They didn't speak of leaving again. Outside, snow kept falling. Inside, their place in that cabin, however new, however fragile, had begun to take root indeed, not trust. And the man who bled for them no longer stood apart from them. He stood with them. By afternoon, the snow slowed to a light drift and the wind dropped low enough that the cabin walls no longer creaked with each gust. The fire in the hearth held steady heat, and for the first time since they'd met, the air in the room wasn't ruled by fear or haste. The mule and horse were sheltered in the lean-to, eating what feed Merritt kept stored in a barrel there. No riders had passed within sight of the ridge. Merritt sat at the table with his back against the wall, stitching his coat where the knife had torn through. Each pull of the needle tugged at his ribs, but he worked at a pace that kept his breathing even. The bandage beneath his shirt had dried into place, and the bleeding had nearly stopped. He still moved like a man whose bones ached with heat under the skin, but he didn't groan or favor the pain unless it forced him to. Sana tore a strip of cloth from the bottom of an old quilt she had found in the chest. Taya held it while Sana braided the fabric with another piece, making a stronger binding for the shoulder of her dress where it had been ripped days earlier. She didn't sew it modestly, only enough to keep it from slipping while she worked and moved. Her hands were better at mending skin than cloth, but she made do. Awi had gone outside to split the last of the stacked wood behind the cabin. Most would assume Merritt should have stopped her, but he didn't. She swung the axe clean and steady, and each strike showed she cut wood before and didn't need watching. Listeners might have wondered where she learned such tasks. She had traveled with men once, brothers and uncles, before soldiers scattered them. Work was either learned quick or not at all. Taya set bowls of beans and dried meat on the table. The smell wasn't rich, but it was hot and steady, and no one complained. She sat near the hearth while she ate, silent, but not as tense as before. The way her shoulders had loosened showed something new. She didn't expect to be moved on again before she finished the meal. When Awi came back inside, she shut the door against the draft and hung the axe by the frame. She watched Merritt a moment before sitting across from him. In the morning, she said, we should check the wash again. If bodies are not buried, animals will scatter them and bring others to look. Merritt didn't ignore that. I'll go with you, he said. Not all the way down, just far enough to drag brush over what's left and check the tracks. You still bleed if you turn too quick, Sana reminded him. I'll keep upright, he said. He didn't soften it into reassurance. Just a fact. Another concern some might have noticed, who would they be if they stayed, and what could force them out? Sana gave the shape of that question words. If settlers come here and say this land is theirs, what do you do? Merritt looked up from his coat. Nobody claims this basin but the cold. Any man who tries will learn the ground before he owns it. Taya glanced at him then, cautious. You have papers? He shook his head. Don't need them. Only men in town care about papers. I don't bring town men here. That answered the worry about legality and land in the simplest terms. His claim was isolation and the willingness to defend it. As the fire settled lower, Sana finished tying the repaired shoulder seam and stood. She went to the window and pushed one shutter open an inch with 2 fingers. She watched the tree line and the slope below for a long breath, then closed it again. You lived here alone since they died? She asked. Yes, he said. No explanation beyond that. You speak Apache before? That question came quiet, unexpected. Merritt paused, thinking back. My wife spoke little. Her uncle more. I learned some when I was with them. Not enough to shame myself. Enough to listen when it counted. That eased something in Sana's expression that hadn't eased before. Awi listened, but didn't interrupt. Taya looked between them with faint surprise. It was the first time any of them had heard him speak of knowing their tongue at all. Merritt added, I won't speak what I don't know, but I understand when a man lies about who he is. It wasn't directed at them, but it sat in the room like a reminder. He'd seen betrayal from both sides of the line. Later, when the light outside began to drop, Awi checked the shutters again and barred the door. Merritt set his rifle where his reach could find it in the dark. Sana laid extra wood by the hearth, so no one would have to open the door again until morning. Taya, for the first time, yawned without trying to hide it. Awi told her to take the bunk for the night. Sana would sleep in the loft, and Awi would take her turn near the fire. Merritt stayed near the door with his back against the wall and one boot planted for leverage. Before quiet settled fully, Sana looked at him and asked something that a listener might have wondered from the beginning. When you saw them take me, did you think I was already dead? He didn't pretend otherwise. I thought they'd break you before they sold you. Either way, you wouldn't walk out of that wash alive. Then why fight? She asked. He met her eyes in the firelight. Because I've seen men do worse to women who begged. And I've stood by once before when I shouldn't have. I won't stand again. There was no pride in his tone, no apology either. Just the truth of someone who had lived long enough to regret silence more than violence. Sana didn't thank him. That wasn't the shape of the moment. She only nodded once, then climbed the ladder to the loft. Awi lay by the fire, knife in hand under the blanket. Merritt listened to the logs crack and the wind fade outside. Taya's breathing grew soft and even. For the first time since the blood in the creek bed, the cabin felt like a place that might hold through the night. Not because danger was gone, but because they were no longer scattered to face it alone. Morning would bring new choices, burying what was left behind them, securing what they'd stepped into, and deciding whether the shelter would remain temporary or become theirs by will, not chance. Nothing about the past had been erased, but for the first time, the future wasn't empty ground. The morning came quiet, with a low pale light and a cold that clung to the windows before the fire could chase it back. No one rushed to speak. When Sana climbed down from the loft, Awi was already at the hearth feeding the flames, and Taya was rubbing her arms through a shirt she'd found in the chest the night before. Merritt was awake, but hadn't stood yet. He'd slept light, back against the wall, rifle within reach, as if he expected someone to test the door before sunrise. He didn't move until the smell of the first coffee boiled in the tin pot reached him. Sana placed a cup in front of him without asking, then checked the bandage at his side. The bleeding had finally stopped for good. The stitches held. The heat in the wound was gone. He could stand without seeing dark at the edge of his sight. Awi had already decided how the day would start. "We go back to the wash," she said. "Cover what's left. If men find the bodies, they'll follow the trail." Merritt pushed himself to his feet. The pain was still there, dull but manageable. "I go too." "You climb slow," Sana warned. "I won't break open," he answered. They gathered only what they needed: rope, 2 shovels from beside the woodpile, a blanket, and the knife Sana kept at her belt. Taya stayed behind to tend the fire and watched the ridge from the loft. She didn't want to stay alone, but she understood they couldn't leave the cabin empty. The snow was thinner than the day before. The ground held the cold, but not the weight of new drifts. They walked in silence, every step careful on the slope. When they reached the wash, there were no new tracks, no sign of riders, no disturbed brush. The bodies of the 2 men Merritt had killed still lay where they'd fallen. Coyotes had not reached them yet, but the smell was starting to rise. Awi dragged broken branches down a bank. Sana helped Merritt roll the nearest body into a shallow depression near the rocks. He winced once when emotion pulled across his ribs, but he didn't slow. They used the shovels to cover both men with dirt and deadwood. It wasn't a true burial, not with the ground half frozen, but no one would find them without digging. Sana pointed to the darker patch of earth where Merritt had bled when he first staggered from the fight. She scooped ash from a burned log and spread it across the stain, then packed snow over it. Awi did the same with the second spot farther down. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to break the trail. Before they left, Sana asked what none of them had yet confirmed. "The one who ran, does he die out here?" Merritt looked east, toward the broken ridge and the draw that led toward the settlement trails. "If he made it somewhere, they're still riding. If he didn't, he's lying under rock or water by now. Either way, he's not coming back to this wash." They returned slower than they came. Merritt stopped once halfway up the rise to catch his breath. Sana stood near him, not offering help, not walking on ahead, just waiting with the kind of patience born from long roads. When they reached the cabin again, Taya opened the door before they knocked. She had kept the fire fed, swept the floor, and brought the mule in closer to the wall so wolves wouldn't near the lean-to. Some listeners might wonder what came next, whether they would part ways now that the danger had passed, or if the cabin was a stop before scattering again. But none of them packed, none asked when they should leave, and Merritt didn't suggest it. Instead, he set the rifle down by the door and said, "We bring in more wood before the next storm. Snow's coming harder before week's end. If someone rides this way, it'll be after that." Awi nodded and went back outside to haul the logs she'd split earlier. Taya rolled up the blankets near the hearth and laid new ones on the bunk and loft. She didn't act like those spaces belonged to someone else anymore. Sana stepped past Merritt and went to the basin. She washed the dirt from her hands, then from her neck, then from the inside of her wrists. The neckline of her dress still hung low, the repaired shoulder holding better now, but leaving part of her chest bare every time she leaned forward. She didn't adjust it unless the fabric got in the way of her work. Merritt watched long enough to take in the quiet way she'd settled her place in the cabin, then looked away and started cutting kindling at the table. The motion pulled across his ribs, but the strength was coming back. By afternoon, the sky darkened again. The wind dropped completely, the kind of stillness that meant the next snow wouldn't drift, it would bury. Awi brought the last stack of wood inside and shut the door. Taya looked from Merritt to the others before speaking. If someone comes in spring, you still keep us here? Merritt didn't look up from a knife he was sharpening. If you walk out, it'll be because you choose it, not because someone takes you. And if men come to take, she asked. He slid the blade back into its sheath. They won't leave with breath in their throats. It wasn't loud. It wasn't said for effect. It was simply true in that space. Awi leaned her back against the wall and crossed her arms. Then I stay. Taya looked to Sana. Sana didn't hesitate. We stay. Merritt gave one short nod. Then this is your place same as mine. Another question that might have lingered in someone's mind. What name did this place have, or would the women be hidden here as shadows? Sana answered that herself when she went to the shelf above the hearth, took a bone-handled all she'd found, and pressed the tip into the wood beam beside the door. She carved 3 small marks, one for each of them, a sign used in their band when words weren't safe to speak. When she finished, she met Merritt's eyes. Now someone knows who lives here. He didn't erase it. He didn't ask her to. That was the only answer needed. As night fell, the 4 of them moved through the cabin without that edge of uncertainty that had followed them since the wash. Merritt sat by the fire, not on guard but present. Sana sat across from him, one leg tucked under the other, sewing the last tear in her dress. Awi rested against the wall with the rifle near her knee, not because she expected attack, but because that space beside the fire now belonged to them. Taya curled on the bunk and let her eyes close without flinching every time wind touched the shutters. Outside, the snow began again, softer than before. Inside, no one was alone, and no one feared being turned out when the storm came. The life ahead of them wasn't spoken, but it was decided, not by promise, but by choice they'd already made. And there was nothing left unfinished.